The first thing I remember is the sound of laughter, sharp, careless, almost musical, but cruel in a way I hadn't heard in a long time. Not the warm laughter of family enjoying each other's company, but the kind that lands heavily on your chest, makes you shrink inside yourself, and reminds you that you don't belong here the way you thought you did. It was a bright Saturday afternoon, the kind of day that should feel light and easy. The garden of my aunt's house was glowing with sunlight. Long tables were set with flowers and polished silverware, and everyone had gathered as they did every year for the family reunion. I had come prepared to smile, to join the chatter, and to pretend that everything was normal, because pretending had always been easier than confronting the quiet judgments and half-whispered opinions. My stepmother, Lena, was sitting beside me. She was quiet as usual, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her head slightly bowed. For 20 years, she had tried to carve a place for herself in a family that never fully welcomed her. Today was no different. A few small comments reached my ears almost immediately, off-hand remarks about how she never understood how things worked, or jokes about how lucky my father was to tolerate her quirks. The words were subtle, the smiles polite, but I could feel the sting beneath them. Something tightened in my chest, that old familiar knot, the one I used to feel as a child when I wanted to speak up but was taught to stay quiet. This time, however, I decided not to shrink. I took a deep breath, feeling the warmth of the sun and the eyes of several family members settle on me. "That's not fair," I said softly, yet with enough clarity to be heard. "She's done more for this family than anyone acknowledges, and she deserves our respect." There was a moment of stunned silence. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. I expected, perhaps naively, that someone would see reason, that my father would look at me and nod, and that the tension would ease. But the silence lasted only a heartbeat before it was shattered by laughter. Sharp, careless, mocking laughter that made my stomach twist. "Dramatic, aren't we?" one cousin said, leaning back in his chair, smirking. "You really think you're right about this?" Another asked, with a tinge of amusement that made it clear I was the entertainment. I looked at my father, my heart aching with hope that he would intervene, that he would say something that would stop the ridicule. But he didn't. He looked down at his plate, avoided my eyes, and said nothing. I felt a pang of betrayal. I hadn't anticipated the subtle, crushing weight of being dismissed by the person whose approval I had spent my whole life seeking. Finally, my uncle leaned back in his chair, folding his arms, his expression one of exaggerated patience. "If you're going to cause scenes," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "maybe you shouldn't be here." I swallowed hard. The lump in my throat burned. I wanted to argue. I wanted to shout. But instead I stood slowly, carefully, keeping my voice calm as I said goodbye to Lena and gave her hand a gentle squeeze. I wanted her to know that I hadn't left because I was afraid. I left because I refused to be part of their cruelty. As I walked away, the laughter followed me, ringing in my ears. "She'll calm down." Someone said. I heard the casual dismissal as though it were a forecast. "She'll get over it." They had no idea I wasn't leaving powerless. They didn't know that the years of quiet work, careful planning, and silent responsibility I had undertaken for the family's well-being had put me in a position they could never touch. I carried knowledge, control, and influence that they assumed I lacked, but they would never know that yet. So I left, calm on the surface, burning inside, feeling both betrayed and quietly proud. For the first time in my life, I realized that speaking truth even gently, even with care, came with consequences, and that sometimes being right and being respected were two very different things. And as I walked away from the reunion, I felt the first flicker of something I hadn't felt before, the realization that power doesn't always need to be loud, and that dignity can be maintained even when the world laughs at you. That night, when I finally closed the door behind me, I didn't cry the way I used to. Not the loud, uncontrolled crying of a child begging for fairness. This was different, quiet, steady, and deliberate, like the slow release of water from a cracked dam. I curled up on my bed, staring at the ceiling, and let the weight of the day settle on me. I thought about the laughter, the casual cruelty, the way my father had refused to defend me. I thought about the countless times I had spoken up in smaller ways, only to be ignored or ridiculed. The truth hit me in sharp, cold pieces. Love in this family had always been conditional. Approval came with performance. Respect came with obedience. Kindness was welcome, but only as long as it served their expectations. And yet I couldn't bring myself to regret defending Lena. Protecting her had felt instinctive, like breathing. She deserved more than the quiet condescension she endured. She deserved someone to stand beside her when the family refused. I had done that, and that mattered, even if no one else could see it yet. I realized something important that night. Silence could teach you more than words ever could. When I stopped trying to explain, to argue, or to justify my actions, I could see things I had overlooked before. Patterns became clear, the way certain relatives only called when they needed help, the way praise disappeared the moment I set a boundary, the subtle hierarchy of attention, who got heard and who was dismissed. I thought about Lena, about her gentle voice, the careful way she had learned to navigate family gatherings, always bending to avoid conflict. How many times had she swallowed her pride so someone else wouldn't feel uncomfortable? How often had she quietly fixed problems that no one even noticed? And I had spent years believing that my loyalty to her would be enough for everyone else to see her worth. That night, for the first time, I understood that seeing someone's value and acting to protect it wasn't always rewarded. Sometimes it went unnoticed, sometimes it made you the target, but that didn't make it wrong. I picked up my phone, expecting the familiar ping of messages, mockery, gossip, excuses. But nothing, silence, and I realized slowly that silence could be a kind of power too. When you stopped responding, when you stopped giving energy to those who thrived on your presence for their own comfort, you forced them to reckon with the reality you had quietly carried all along. I lay there thinking about my own work, the things my family didn't know about, the careful management of accounts, partnerships, and responsibilities that kept certain aspects of our shared lives functioning smoothly. No one asked, no one even suspected. I had built structures quietly, patiently, like a gardener tending hidden roots. And in that quiet I had control they assumed I lacked. For the first time, I felt a flicker of calm. Not the shallow calm that comes from pretending everything is fine. This was something deeper. A calm rooted in knowledge, in self-reliance, in understanding that emotional strength was forged in silence and observation, not in confrontation or drama. I let the silence stretch, letting it teach me. I thought about boundaries and respect. I thought about how easily people confuse attention with admiration, how easily you can be overlooked when you speak truth too softly for their ears. And I understood that my worth did not depend on acknowledgement. It depended on integrity, on quiet, deliberate choices. And in that quiet, I began to see the first glimmer of the next step, patience, a decision to let time reveal what words could not, to allow the consequences of their actions to unfold naturally, to protect Lena not only in the moment, but in the long, steady arc of reality. I finally drifted off to sleep that night with a strange sense of peace. It wasn't the relief of victory. It wasn't the comfort of approval. It was the calm of knowing that I had done what was right, that I had acted with dignity, and that, in time, the truth slowly, surely, would speak for itself. The next morning, I woke up with a calm I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't the brittle calm of pretending nothing happened. It was something deeper, a steady center that comes from knowing your own worth. The night's reflection had crystallized into clarity. My family didn't see me, not fully. They saw the role I played at their convenience, but they didn't see the careful, deliberate work I had done behind the scenes. I moved through my morning ritual quietly, sipping tea while the sunlight fell across the living room. For years, I had quietly managed many of the family's affairs, from finances to logistics, decisions no one had acknowledged or even noticed. My father had trusted me with the responsibilities my uncles ignored, my cousins assumed were trivial, and my aunt barely understood. It wasn't arrogance that drove me, it was necessity. Someone had to keep things from falling apart. And I had done it silently because I valued stability over recognition. That morning, as I glanced at the messages piling up in my phone, I realized how fragile the family's sense of control really was. My stepmother had always been underestimated, but in reality, much of the family's comfort relied on my quiet management. The fact that they laughed at me yesterday didn't change the reality. They depended on me, whether they knew it or not. I didn't rush to correct them. I didn't send messages demanding acknowledgement. I simply observed. The silence I had maintained the night before had a weight to it, one that they had not anticipated. And slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, that weight began to shift the balance of their attention. By late morning, my father had sent a single text, "We need to talk." I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I let the message sit, letting him feel the quiet I had cultivated. The truth, I realized, was far more powerful than any confrontation. It didn't need to be loud. It didn't need drama. All it needed was patience and presence. I spent the day going about my own work, continuing the tasks I had quietly managed for years. It was remarkable, in a way, how much of the family's daily life relied on decisions I had made without fanfare, without applause. I remembered contracts I had reviewed, accounts I had reconciled, agreements I had overseen. All of it invisible to them, yet essential. I realized how often we mistake visibility for value. How often people are unaware of the foundation holding their world steady. By afternoon, the first ripple of recognition began. My uncle, who had ridiculed me the day before, called asking for clarification on a financial matter he hadn't understood. My cousins hesitated before sending messages that normally would have been snarky, unsure how to navigate the reality that I wasn't reacting as expected. My father, too, hesitated, perhaps realizing that his dismissal had consequences deeper than he had anticipated. What amazed me most was not their panic. It was my own calm. I had nothing to prove. I didn't need to lecture anyone or assert my authority. The quiet observation, the patience, and the years of steady work had given me something far more powerful than their approval: control. Not over them, but over myself, over my choices, and over the systems they had assumed would crumble without their input. By evening, my father appeared at my door. His expression was a mixture of surprise, hesitation, and something else I hadn't expected: humility. "I didn't realize," he began. I didn't interrupt. I simply listened. Sometimes the most profound acknowledgement doesn't require words from you. It arrives in their own recognition, quietly, without fanfare. And in that moment, I understood a deeper lesson. Real power isn't demonstrated through drama or confrontation. It's held in silence, patience, and the careful decisions you make when no one is watching. The things they never thought I controlled, the steady, unseen foundations, were now undeniable. And I had achieved that not by proving myself to anyone, but by remaining calm, observant, and unwavering in my dignity. That night I sat with Lena and smiled softly. "They'll understand eventually," I whispered, and she nodded, relief and gratitude filling her eyes. I didn't need to say more. Sometimes quiet strength speaks louder than any words ever could. The days that followed were quiet, almost surreal. I hadn't spoken loudly, I hadn't demanded apologies, and I certainly hadn't made dramatic gestures. And yet the atmosphere around my family began to shift. The laughter that had echoed at the reunion felt distant now, almost like a memory from another life. It started with small things. My father called first, his voice hesitant, carrying the weight of someone realizing their mistake. I didn't understand how much you were managing," he admitted. "I see now how wrong we were yesterday." I listened quietly, without interrupting. There was no satisfaction in exposing their ignorance, no need to lecture or correct. The recognition itself, arriving from reflection rather than confrontation, carried more power than any words I could have spoken. Later, my uncle reached out, asking for guidance on matters he had previously dismissed. My cousins sent messages with tentative questions, unsure how to approach me after the events of the reunion. Each interaction reinforced a single truth. Respect cannot be demanded, it is earned quietly, and sometimes it arrives only after patience and silence have done their work. By the end of the week, invitations arrived again, carefully worded, cautious, and sincere, but this time I didn't rush to respond. I considered my own boundaries first. I thought about Lena and the comfort she deserved, the quiet dignity I had promised myself. And when I did finally accept, it wasn't to prove anything. It was a choice rooted in self-respect, in the recognition that my presence could be given freely, not as a bargaining chip. At the next family gathering, the atmosphere was noticeably different. The same people who had laughed at me yesterday were now careful in their words, measured in their jokes, as if realizing for the first time that I was not to be taken lightly. I didn't gloat. I smiled gently, engaged warmly with Lena, and allowed the moment to pass without drama. The quiet acknowledgement in their eyes was enough. It wasn't humiliation. It wasn't a victory lap. It was understanding, and it felt profound. Later that evening, Lena approached me privately. Her eyes glistened with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered softly, "for standing up for me even when it cost you." I shook my head. "I didn't do it to be recognized," I said. "I did it because it was right. That's all that matters." She squeezed my hand, and in that simple gesture, I felt something I had rarely experienced with this family: genuine connection and mutual respect. The lessons of the past, pain, betrayal, and misunderstanding, had not been erased, but they had transformed. They became the foundation for a new understanding, one built on honesty, patience, and emotional strength. That night, I reflected on the journey I had traveled. I had begun as a gentle, trusting girl, willing to give my heart and words freely, even at the risk of ridicule. I had been hurt, humiliated, dismissed, but through silence, observation, and unwavering patience, I had discovered a deeper strength. I had learned that dignity does not require raising your voice. Emotional power does not demand recognition. True respect often arrives quietly, after those who underestimate you realize what they have relied on all along. And in that calm, reflective moment, I felt peace, real, unshakable peace. I realized that boundaries are not walls to push people away. They are bridges to show who you are and what you value. Love and loyalty do not have to cost self-respect, and sometimes the most profound victories are invisible, unfolding in silence, observation, and quiet integrity. I smiled softly, closing my eyes. For the first time in years, I was not just present, I was whole. not through the acknowledgement of others, but through my own choices, my own strength, and my own quiet dignity. And that, I realized, was the kind of victory that lasts forever,